The argument of this course develops according to two convergent logics. The first is the logic of a sequence of themes. The theme set for today is finance, and for next week, regulation. And this logic is, as it were, unilinear, one theme after another. The second logic is the struggle to develop a view, a vision, an understanding of the crisis, and through an understanding of the crisis, an altered understanding of the economy. And this second logic advances in a spiral. So I begin the class today concerned above all with this second logic. But as you shall see, I shall fold a brief discussion of finance into the next stage in the development of a view, of a general view of the crisis. I make 5 sets of remarks. 4 of those sets of remarks are addressed to 4 distinct approaches to the crisis. And the 5th set of remarks speaks to finance. I have placed this 5th set of remarks third rather than last in the sequence, for reasons that will soon become apparent. I ask for your close and undivided attention. There are many moving parts in this argument.
We'll just move the blackboard.
But the course is being recorded, and the video will soon be on the website, as with all of our classes. I distinguish between 2 sets of approaches. The first set are 2 conventional approaches, which I have called the regulated market / conventional Keynesian approach, and sound finance doctrine. And the second set of approaches I have labeled the conservative structural approach and the progressive structural approach. They can be distinguished, these 2 sets, in the following ways. First, in the simplest form, they can be distinguished by the conception of the relation between finance and the real economy. What I am calling the conventional approaches see the essential problem of the crisis as lying in finance itself, and then in the contamination of the real economy by finance. The structural approaches see the chief part of the problem as residing in the real economy and in the relation of finance to the real economy. Now comes a second, somewhat more complicated standard of distinction between these 2 sets of approaches. Underlying the first set of approaches is a narrative. It is the familiar narrative that animates most of the established debate about the crisis in the United States and in the world. according to this narrative. There are speculative excesses in finance combined with regulatory failure or forbearance. Then there is a crisis of confidence that soon becomes a crisis in demand, which in turn turns into a collapse of real activity, including the employment of labor. The second set of approaches embraces a broader narrative. It is not the opposite of the first narrative. It incorporates the first narrative into a larger story. And this broader narrative includes the following elements. In August of 1961, the Bretton Woods regime designed in the aftermath of the Second World War collapsed. The United States went off the gold standard. And that moment initiated a sequence of events that form the causal background to the present crisis. On the one hand, in major developed economies of the Western world, of the North Atlantic world, there was a progressive extension of credit and a dynamic of indebtedness of households and of firms. And credit was used to a significant extent as a functional surrogate for redistribution. On the other hand, in the emerging economies that ran large commercial and saving surpluses, the internal reorganization of the market, or the deepening of the internal market, was not undertaken. Instead, it was replaced by export-oriented growth. In the world as a whole, what prevailed was debt-driven trade as a simulacrum of true free trade. And the monetary policy of the major central banks in the world was wielded to accommodate these developments. So that is the broader narrative embraced by the second set of approaches. Now let me begin the summary analysis of each approach. First, the regulated market conventional Keynesian approach. The theoretical background to this approach, the dominant approach, of the centrist and of the left-of-center policymakers, is the doctrine of Keynes with all the interesting parts left out. So the interesting parts are the parts that have to do with radical uncertainty and with the susceptibility of the economy to permanent disequilibrium. What is left over after the interesting parts are excluded is the misshapen rump of the ideas about the downward rigidity of wages and the need to support aggregate demand. formalized through the contraptions of the ISLM models in the macroeconomic textbooks. The orientation has three main parts. The first is bailout or cleanup, including nationalization and debt acquisition of failed or failing firms. The second is the re-regulation of financial markets. And the third is stimulus. The stimulus, in turn, has two parts. The first part goes under the label of quantitative easing. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, quantitative easing is one of the many pseudo-technical terms that abound in the contemporary policy discourse. It means the debasement of the currency through the printing of money. The second part of the stimulus is the combination of tax cuts with public spending. Now, notice two facts about this first approach. The first fact is that the present circumstance is, in a sense, the inverse of the circumstance to which this shrunken Keynesianism was or is primarily directed. After all, the present collapse of demand, if there can be said to be a collapse, was preceded by artificially amplified demand through the pseudo-democratization of credit. And there is an argument that the same was essentially true of the Great Depression, of the circumstance of the 1930s. The second thing to notice about this first approach is that it confronts a problem that we shall encounter in each of these approaches, a recurrent problem. The problem is that the level of deficit-funded stimulus that is fiscally sustainable and politically feasible may not be great enough to do the work, the limited work of recovery. So when I say that the level that is fiscally sustainable may not be sufficient to do the work, I mean something precise. The level of deficit-funded stimulus that is not so great that it would generate a crisis of confidence in the sovereign debt, in the public debt of the governments. Now we come to a second approach that I am calling sound finance doctrine. The theoretical backdrop is the resurgence of the so-called Treasury view of the 1920s, the view associated with the British Treasury in the 1920s. The keynote is skepticism about the efficacy of both accommodative monetary policy and also, and above all, fiscal stimulus. And this skepticism has been theorized in two parallel ways, to which Richard Friedman will speak more later in the class. One is the idea of the so-called Ricardian equivalence. The basic notion is that the efficacy of the fiscal stimulus will be attenuated or entirely annulled by the expectation that the economic agents have that the lowering of taxes now will be compensated by a raising of taxes later. This is simply a renaming of an idea formulated by Arthur Pigou, a student of Alfred Marshall's, in the first half of the 20th century, under the name of the real balance effect. And the second way in which this skepticism has been theorized is so-called real business cycle theory. So the idea is that the problem arises from exogenous shocks to productivity or supply that a fiscal stimulus may be relatively ineffective to counteract. It turns out that these shocks are not exogenous to the economy. They are only exogenous to a certain understanding of the economy. The practical outcome is the toleration of a moderate stimulus in the short term, without much hope that it will do great good, only that it will avoid the aggravation of evil, to be followed by the reassertion of the neutrality of money and by fiscal discipline in the medium term. So the basic attitude is what the physicians call therapeutic nihilism. Now, before addressing the second pair of approaches, which I have called structural, I make a series of remarks about finance. And the reason for the placement of these remarks about finance in this position is that finance can be seen as a major chain of transmission between events in the money economy and transformations of the real economy. And this is the perspective taken in what I have called the structural approaches. Now, there are two ways to look at finance in general. The first way, the familiar way, is to consider finance as a specialized activity, a special world, with its distinctive interests, agents, and practices. Viewed from this angle, finance is characterized by a menu of familiar problems and of problem-solving skills. How to assess credit risk, how to price an option, how to customize a financial product, or to invent one, typically by means of the analogical recombination of the elements of existing financial products, the better to take advantage of an arbitrage opportunity. Despite the veneer of technical complexity that results from the frequent use of mathematical models and the occasional subtleties that arise from the creation of new derivatives of the property right and the establishment of markets in them, the preponderant part of this financial activity is, on the whole, less complicated and less demanding than the work of a plumber or an electrician. To conceive it as the subject matter of an arcane science or an elusive art is nothing short of preposterous. This conceit serves a purpose. The purpose is to justify or to conceal the rents that accrue to the firm or to the individual as a result of its stranglehold over a franchise or of his place within the franchise. Now, there is a second way to look at finance. The second way to look at finance is to think of it in the most general terms, as simply the organization of capital allocation. Of risk, of information and of insight in an economy that is based on money rather than on barter. And viewed in this more telling light, the most important fact about finance is that it operates in a very broad setting from which arise ineradicable sources of instability. I have made a brief and open list of these sources of instability. The first source of instability is the evolution of technology, technological revolution, which is always indeterminate in its social and economic effects. The effects, for example, on the division of returns to labor and to capital, or on the level of employment, are always mediated through the institutional arrangements shaped by politics. The second source of instability has to do with the haphazard character of the institutional setting in which finance operates. The setting today could be described in the following way. The regulatory and institutional framework established in the course of the social democratic or New Deal settlement of the mid-20th century has been partly hollowed out as a result of the resurgence of what I call sound finance doctrine and also of the political influence of the financial interests. Sometimes hollowed out through actual change of the laws, as in the repeal of Glass-Steagall. Sometimes hollowed out through regulatory forbearance. And sometimes hollowed out through the creation of a space of autonomous financial innovation. The major strategy of regulation that prevailed in the whole world in the second half of the 20th century was what could be called regulatory dualism. The coexistence of a thickly regulated sector with a thinly regulated sector. And this distinction was justified on the basis of the idea that the high net worth individuals and financial professionals who operate in the thinly regulated sector would not require such paternalism. But the practical outcome is that everything that was prohibited in the thickly regulated sector could be repackaged and done anyway in the thinly regulated sector, and that is in fact what happened. Now, the result is that the institutional and regulatory setting that exists is in no sense a system with a logic, but just an entirely circumstantial correlation of forces, a compromise of interests and ideas that no one could predict and that no one could infer from an abstract conception. The implication is that the institutional setting is entirely unstable, precisely because it is not a system or the embodiment of a logic. A third source of instability has to do with the relation between economic and political forces. Under democracy, those who lose out in the economy can fight back in politics. This fighting back is sometimes described as populism, but it's really just another name for democracy. And the asymmetrical relation between political and economic influence is a third source of instability. A fourth source of instability results from the inexorable limits to the attempt to use the expansion of credit as a functional surrogate for real redistribution. And in particular for redistribution achieved through an institutionalized broadening of economic and educational opportunity. It is bound to produce asset price bubbles and subsequent collapse. A fifth source of instability is international anarchy. I have placed here on the lower part of the blackboard the familiar textbook macroeconomic trilemma. And the basic idea is that of these three goals, free capital flows, fixed exchange rates, and independent monetary policy, only two of the three can coexist at any given time. You can't have all three. But my point is not to analyze or assess this conception. It's simply to say the following. In the present situation, the United States now lives under the combination of free capital flows with independent monetary policy. Many major emerging economies combine free capital flows with fixed exchange rates, reconciled through the so-called golden straitjacket, the genuflection to financial confidence, and macroeconomic orthodoxy or pseudo-orthodoxy. And China, strictly speaking, accepts only one of the three, the fixed exchange rates. So there is no general system in the world, and this lack of a system is part of the causal background to the enormous imbalances between the major economies in the world. A sixth source of instability has to do with the ideologies guiding the major central banks of the world. For example, what will their attitude to such imbalances be? Will they think of them, as has often recently been the case, as simply the expression of natural and self-correcting market forces, and in this way attempt somehow to naturalize or rationalize this hodgepodge? So the situation is that finance operates in a setting permeated by all of these sources of instability, interacting, acting together. You will have noticed in the readings that we have assigned what is perhaps the most salient theoretical tendency in recent years, which is the claim that the traditional approach in the internal world of finance has improperly disregarded or discounted these supposedly extreme risks that arise from the setting. But this is a confusion of objective uncertainty with subjective ignorance. How these sources of instability will manifest themselves is clearly uncertain. That they will manifest themselves is absolutely certain. So a financier imagines that the world is flat and sees only to the horizon. And then events arise from outside this horizon, from the setting that I've just described, that appear to him as miraculous. And then the theoreticians come and say, we have developed a theory that distinguishes between the natural and the miraculous events. In this way, flattering the self-deception and the ignorance of the financier. We should tell him something else. We should tell him, broaden your horizons. Now, consider the practical application of this thesis to the understanding of speculative activity. The stock market is in part, as Keynes argued, beauty contest. The point is to guess what the average opinion of the others is. But it is also simultaneously a trading of stakes in real firms with real returns or real earnings in a real economy. And the whole task is to relate in understanding and in practice these two points of view. A disillusioned speculator with long-standing familiarity with the fads and foibles of his fellow financiers, with a modicum of education and analytical acuity that renders him recalcitrant to intellectual fashion, who has taken to heart Keynes's admonition that the markets can remain irrational for longer than you can stay solvent, but who understands the difference between these prejudices and the course of the real economy, is much more likely to be successful over the medium term than a mathematician converted into a money man who is astonished by the political construction of social and economic reality. Now, with these remarks about finance in mind, I go on to the last set of approaches, which I call the structural approaches. The first there is the conservative structural approach. There is a very interesting emerging literature that exemplifies this line. I think that the best expression is a recent book by the banker and economist Richard Duncan called The Corruption of Capitalism, just published. The title itself exemplifies the alacrity of the conservatives and of the business press in embracing the retrograde Marxist concept of capitalism. The starting point is the idea that the major problem arises from the real economy. So the United States, for example, according to this view, no longer produces enough of what the world wants. And the expansion of credit facilitated by an accommodating monetary policy has long been used to mask this basic structural weakness, according to this view. So the pragmatic implication is a transitional use of a fiscal stimulus to avoid the worst, without much hope that it can fix the problem. Once again, the issue is that the maximum stimulus, politically feasible and fiscally sustainable, that is compatible with the avoidance of collapse of confidence in the sovereign debt, will not be sufficient to ensure real recovery. The neutrality of money and fiscal discipline should be asserted in the medium term once the problem is overcome. But what is really needed, according to this view, is a growth strategy. And now, in this emerging literature, come two examples of the main line of such a growth strategy. One example is that there should be an activist industrial policy supposedly betting on the sectors of the future, like green technologies, biotechnology, and nanotechnology. A second idea is that there should be a virtuous circle between investment coming from the rich economies and demand arising from the emerging economies. But notice that the relation between the analytic or diagnostic view and the programmatic response is very loose and contingent. There is no close relation between one and the other. The essential distinction between what I am calling the conservative structural approach and the progressive structural approach lies in this: that the premise of the progressive structural approach is that the market economy can and should be reshaped in its institutional content. The necessary but inadequate fiscal stimulus should be designed as a down payment on a program of structural change, as the first step. So we should select from the possible forms of fiscal stimulus that subset of forms that also serves the program of structural reorganization. And without entering into institutional detail, because we shall discuss all of this later in the course, the institutional reorganization should have two main objects. The first object is innovation in the arrangements that organize the relation between finance and production, so that more of long-term saving is channeled into long-term productive investment rather than being squandered in a financial casino. And the second goal is the institutionalized broadening of access to economic and educational opportunity, especially in the context of the present supersession of Fordist mass production, so that less of the creative and constructive potential of the majority is wasted. Now, these two goals are ends in themselves, but they are also valuable in a second derivative way, because according to this view, they diminish the vulnerability of the economy to crises such as this one. Now I conclude. On the basis of this analysis of the four approaches, and in particular the statement of the fourth approach, which the progressive structural approach, you could say there are two central problems. But in a sense, the second problem is a solution to the first problem to the extent that the first problem can be solved. The first problem is what I've called here the min-max problem. It's the problem that has reappeared in the discussion of each of these four approaches. The problem is that the maximum fiscal stimulus that seems politically feasible and fiscally sustainable, that is not likely to produce a collapse of confidence in sovereign debt, does not reach the minimum threshold necessary to ensure recovery. Now, a historical claim could be that we have encountered this problem before. We discussed this before in the very first class. That in the 1930s, the proto-Keynesian programs of stimulus, in fact, failed to take the depressed economies out of depression. They simply weren't big enough and couldn't be. And what took those economies out of depression was war. And the only economy that succeeded in overcoming depression before the war was the one that imposed a war economy before the war. So strictly speaking, then the idea is that the fiscal stimulus could prevent an aggravation of the crisis without ensuring a real recovery. And on this view, if this is all we have, it would be as if the Japan that resulted from the 1990s would then become the world writ large. An inconclusive, failed escape from the crisis. Now comes the second problem, which is the problem that I am calling the problem of reform and recovery. My claim is, unlike the first problem, the second problem has a solution. The problem of recovery and reform is how we can design the policies of recovery, and in particular the fiscal stimulus, in such a way that they represent the down payment or the first step to the structural reconstruction. And then ensure a form of growth that, in combination with the relatively ineffective fiscal stimulus, will prevent the world from becoming Japan writ large. And ensure the real recovery, the socially inclusive growth that all humanity desires. My conjecture, therefore, is that the first problem, the min-max problem, is insoluble. Except to the extent that it is solved by the solution of the second problem, the problem of the relation between reform and recovery. So, ladies and gentlemen, there is hope. There is hope for transformation because there is hope for insight.
Well, I'll make some comments on this. We'll have a little discussion, and then we'll lower the screen and I'll give
You know, I forgot to put this on.
Oh my, oh boy, there was a good stuff. Oh, that's so bad. I'll put it on, but then people won't know
No.
what I'm reacting to.
I'll have to do something after the fact. Correct.
Okay, yeah, I thought, actually, it was very depressing, what you said, because, but I think there's a lot of realism to it, and let me go through some comments. Because one of your first comments, was the only one I really disagree with intently, but in some sense, this is it comes back to the conclusion. Would be that optimistic or pessimistic? Because you said the limited work of recovery. And I think that the work of recovery is absolutely not limited. And if we do not recover, it's going to be, it's not just Japan ad infinitum. Japan, if we were all like Japan, we're a wealthy country and we're moseying along in a peaceful way. But of course, when you gave the examples of the pre-World War II examples, those were much worse than current Japan. So I actually think many of the problems you laid out in getting a recovery without reform are valid. And I just, fingers crossed, that we do see a real recovery. And I think that is a major task, and that's what the governments are desperately, some of the governments trying to do. Let me make a couple of comments about how limited our recovery has been. Now, there's a recent NBR working paper that does the very simple task of taking what the state and local governments are doing, which is adding to the depression or recession by cutting spending because they're under absolute budget constraints. They are sound finance to the end. And then looks at what the size of the current US stimulus is with this big negative going on as well. And it turns out the stimulus is pretty modest. So we actually have managed a very, I would not be surprised, you'd have to do the calculation very carefully, because remember, one of the major criticisms of the depression stimulus, quote, the fiscal stimulus, was it was very small. And I don't think ours may not be much bigger than that if you add in the state and local. So I think there's a giant problem there. It was interesting in the sound finance discussion, monetary neutrality has, let me phrase it correctly, no evidentiary base in the medium and long run, period. The European Central Bank has done studies. Other economists have done studies. The monetary mistakes that we make are going to cause problems ad infinitum for a long period of time. So I thought when you said...
Just one interjection, Richard.
Sure.
I did not mean to, in describing this idea of Ricardian equivalence, to approve it.
No, I know. No, that's correct.
Basis.
No. And I'll talk about the ideas from a different perspective in a few minutes. But no, I just want to say that is one of the things that they have stuck with, and they've stuck with it even when they see their own evidence. So I was at a meeting with the European Central Bank, and the guys come in with their studies, and they say, look, it's going to be our interest rate policies, our monetary policy days, by these sophisticated econometric shenanigans, are going to have an effect 15 years down the road. That's medium or long run, how you want to call it. And I was a little bit shocked. I said, you mean to say your things today, and then you start thinking what goes on. Let's just take an example. If they raise interest rates at a particular period of time, and that reduces investments, that means the capital stock that the society will have 5-10 years down the road, the long-term capital stock, will be lower. And that really is harming things. So that's a point I would stress. The other place I suppose I disagree, I think I'm always surprised at how stable the institutions are. I'm surprised how quickly the banks have come back. I'm surprised how, we've seen in the readings of the course, that everybody predicts capitalism comes to some, dire thing. And the Japanese is probably far more realistic than the typical dire thing. But I think one of the great problems is this is a highly stable system. And thus, that makes it hard to do certain kinds of reforms. And I don't know the way around that, to be honest. And then there's just one other area. On the list of the two reforms, I'm going to be much more, what's the correct, orthodox or something, on putting a lot of stress on the finance part. Because if you take a country that has resolved, as much as any country in the history of the world will ever resolve the access to economic and educational opportunity, that country is Sweden. Sweden really has, you cannot imagine anything more. And they produce more PhDs and more college graduates. Oh, that whole side works awesomely. 1992, due to housing price speculation by people who were not, it wasn't the inequality, the lack of real wages. Basically, the finance and production thing got screwed up. They did minor, they're not minor, outside person thinks they're minor tweaks in the finance sector. And lo and behold, it set in place in Sweden the same speculative things we've had here. That's why the Swedish government took over to the whole banking system, really nationalized them, cleaned it up, and then 15 years later, they're still never recovered from this horrible disaster. So while I'm favorable to the more access and the normal workers should be given real wages and so on, I think even if that got totally resolved, the history is that the finance side is, even in Sweden, the squeaky, horrible wheel that can bring down the whole cart and causes problems. And then my just last comment, because you thought you were ending optimistically, I thought, oh my God. Because I think it's very possible that we cannot get real recovery without the reforms. The United Kingdom, there's a lot of discussion now that the deficit is too big, that the pound is falling, that they have to raise interest rates. I'm going to the UK tonight to participate in some of this debate. And the Tory party, which may get elected, seems to have adopted what you would call the sound finance kind of view. It's never clear what they're saying in the politics, what they're going to say when they get in office. And that really would be a potential disaster. They would be pulling the plug with their deficit rate being higher than ours. And we could just see that we do not have enough to make a recovery. And I don't see how if the recovery does not occur, where we get the strength or the thing to go down reforms. Even modest reforms will be killed off by a failure of a recovery. So I agree with most of what you said, and I can give you more evidence to support some parts of it. But I think, to me, it's very depressing analysis in some sense, and I fear it's close. It's got a reasonable chance of being on target in the negative way. It may very well be we're not going to recover at the extent we'd hoped. It may very well be one more disaster in the world, be it the Greek thing. They think they got that covered. Then it's going to be the Brits. There'll be one. It's a very fragile system, and I think to go back to the first point, the limited work of recovery is not limited now. We have to not fall into this collapse that you correctly referred to. In the 30s, unemployment in 19 was at 37, went up to 19% from whatever it had been, 11, 12, I don't have the numbers in front of me. So you generated an 8% increase by Roosevelt making a sound finance decision to cut the deficit at that time. And then one just wonders, the pressures put on the people to do that now. I think we're in a it's very scary. That would be my view. So be it. Yeah.
So I'm curious, so you talk about the progressive structural approach. What can the progressive structural approach do with the problem of international anarchy? it seems that that's one of these institutional problems which can't really be addressed by a single nation's policy. So what can we do instead of just changing in the U.S. to really affect world change in that kind of way?
No, it can't be resolved. So that part of the problem requires international coordination. And we will discuss this later, but I'll just say something very general about what I believe the main defect of efforts at international coordination in the second half of the 20th century has been. The main defect has been the option for what you could call institutional maximalism. And it is very clearly manifest in the evolution of the world trade regime under the WTO treaties. That is the idea that we should incorporate into the regime of free trade a series of rules and requirements that impose a commitment not just to the market economy, but to a very particular version of the market economy. For example, prohibiting under the label subsidies all the forms of strategic coordination between governments and firms that the countries now rich use to become rich. Or incorporating the present system of intellectual property, the patent regime, invented at the end of the 19th century. It doesn't have to be that way. The pre-existing trade regime of the GATT was characterized by an institutional minimalism. And its goal was the maximum of free trade with the minimum of institutional imposition. The consequence of this maximalism that is generally manifest in not just the trade regime, but generally the way that the Bretton Woods organizations have conducted themselves, the IMF vis-a-vis the emerging economies until recently, is that the rebellion against the formula that the authorities want to impose turns into a rebellion against the international coordination itself. And that's what happened. So I believe that the fundamental requirement for progress in international coordination is that we get rid of this impulse towards institutional maximalism.
I'm going to pull the slide down to
Yes.
give the question while I do this.
So you're talking
What do I
about,
push?
Stimulus being not likely, like a good stimulus would be one that's not likely to produce collapse of confidence and
Oh.
debt.
Good gracious.
See,
The room blows up. Don't.
today as
No, first of all, let me quarrel with your statement just now. What I said was, from my standpoint, a good stimulus is the one that represents a down payment on the desirable structural reconstruction of the economy. That's the goal. That's what makes it good. But a problem with any form of fiscal stimulus is this problem that I described as the min-max problem, which is recognized in all of these approaches. Namely, our anxiety that the maximum stimulus that is feasible fiscally and politically may not reach the minimum threshold to make it effective. And I say, with respect to that problem is insoluble, except to the extent that the second problem is soluble. So the first problem can be solved only as a byproduct of the solution of the second problem. That's my basic conjecture.
So my question is, do you see the stimulus packages today in countries that already suffer from hundreds of percent of debt to GDP?
Yeah, but you know, push one of these buttons, you think? Got the screen down.
As being,
On or off? Turn it on?
being packages that do not that will not produce a collapse in confidence?
I think that many economies in the world now feel that they're reaching the brink, that they're exploring the limits of what is feasible
That's right.
by way of collapse of sovereign debt. and they want to keep at some safe distance from this brink. But my supposition, as I said, is that this is not a soluble problem.
Well,
Yes.
I would hope it is.
Well, I just wanted to sort of sketch out some of the linkages between those points. Because, for instance, if you look at something like Greece, right? Like, I think it's fair to say that Greece cannot put in additional stimulus. So that route is definitely dead for them. But it also seems to me that it can't do some of the structural work when it is in this fiscal straitjacket that it is in right now.
Yes.
I don't see how it can expand economic opportunity or educational opportunity. I don't even see how it can really take on finance, given that it's completely dependent on financiers right now to, sort of support its foreign markets. So it seems to me that it's out of all options, not just options of the first option, right? And other countries might be approaching it in that sense.
No. So I think you have to analyze the situation in its particular context. So in an extreme situation like that one, presumably the total acceptance of a fiscal straitjacket, as you say, may reach a point that inhibits any kind of structural progress. But there is a solution. The solution is to get rid of the fiscal straitjacket. The problem is that it's a political adventure.
You mean
But-
in terms of default, or just on the end?
Well, there are many forms of it. Many forms of default, leaving the Eurozone, there are different variations. But simply surrendering to the authorities in Brussels or to Germany or to the German banks is certainly not, in principle, the only possible solution.
We will hold off these cosmic questions, issues. I want to present something about the real business cycle and the rational expectations view. That is the other view out there. So this is, I call this return of Keynesianism, but it may be of the weak Keynesianism that we had in the Great Depression, which those policies were adopted before Keynes came into place as well, before he wrote his book. The book came out. This is the general view of I would say, the efficient market. There was a time when, this is Milton Friedman's quote, we're all Keynesians. And he favored, monetary policy more than fiscal, but everybody agreed. And then Roberto referred to the going off the gold standard. So I want to remind you the great president who did that is over there, who also referred to himself as a Keynesian thing. And so you sort of say, well, what happened that led this general Keynesian perspective, though with a monetarist twist from Friedman, to disappear? And why did it move to this real business cycle and rational expectations kind of position? I think people became discouraged with the stagflation of the 1970s, and some inconsistencies with the Keynes model with rational optimizing behavior. I want to talk about the rational expectations as a key thing that underlies a lot of the macro theory that hopefully is being blown up, by events. And I view this not as a statement that we're observing how people are behaving, but I called it a model closing assumption, and meaning the following. And almost every economic decision is investment in the future. Expectations are critical for, are we going to walk out of the room in a second? We're expecting there are not going to be some guys with machine guns standing outside the room. If we expected that, we would go out the back door, I suppose. And the problem that the economists who worry over this is that if you don't have these rational expectations, there's always an incredible inconsistency there. The four stooges that I showed in the first slide can make money to this. There's money on the ground. And the example I'm going to use is of you choosing a career. and I assume 2 periods for you. Now you're studying, and you have some expectations about what life is going to be like when you graduate and get your career. So W star, I do use wages, but I mean everything. Your whole, do you have a good place to work? Do you have autonomy? All the things you may want in your career. You don't obviously know the W star, so you're just like an investor in the finance market. All you know is the current W. If we assume anything except for the rational expectations, you are always having incorrect expectations. And this is the classic economics model. This is the cobweb model, which you may have had someplace with having to do with corn and hogs. And I phrased the thing in terms of the second period. This is when you've graduated. There's a supply curve. And the supply curve depends upon what your expectations were in the first period. That just captures expectations. You made your decision, and now you're supplying your labor. There's a demand curve, which is there in the second period. And you look and you see we have a supply equals something S plus this. Demand equals X minus this. Turns out it's not soluble because we have to tell you something about what determined your expectations. That's the missing variable. That's the missing variable in a whole lot of economics, is how do people form those expectations? One way is to study how people form expectations, and probably that's a whole lot of the current behavioral economics. The other way is the rational expectations, as we'll see. What I did here was I just looked and solved this equation, simple algebra. And it turns out the solution, except, as we'll see in a minute, for one value of the expectations, the W star 1, it always will be that when you have good expectations about the career when you graduate, it's going to be bad. And when you have bad ones, it's going to be good. And this really troubled some of the macroeconomics people. When the cobweb was thought of as farmers doing their thing, gee, the price of corn is really good, I'll produce lots of corn, but so does every other farmer, and then the price of corn goes down, that's farmers. But they were thinking about this for people like them, et cetera. So I just put down here, that's the thing, unless W star has this special form. And that's why the rational expectations became very attractive to some people. That it became a way of closing a model. I mean, I put it in the simple, you're choosing your career. You can put it in the fancy finance models too. It's the exact same thing. It just says, and the only way this operates is if, in fact, you're expecting a stable market, and it's exactly the stable equilibrium that you know. So you know precisely what the world is going to be next. Not precisely, excuse me, on average. There's some random things, but on average, you got to be correct. Here shows the little cobweb thing, wiggling around in the way that it does, which most of the analyses have it that this is a very stable thing. This one shows you it blowing up. Well, we know that can't be true because the world just doesn't blow up in that way. So maybe it sometimes blows up in finance, where supposedly they have these rational expectations. But there's the model. Usually we get dampened cycles. So and that's why in the corns and the hogs maybe there's some this. So their solution is to say on average people have got to be right, or else there's this money to be made. You're always wrong. Every time I have a positive expectation, it's always negative. Things came out the other way. So I just said, well, on average, this is what they do. On average, the W star 1 equals the actual wage that observes there. I didn't take the expectations to show on average. So you just take that as I can put those in error terms. You solve. Get that value, market clearing wage. So everyone expects the market clearing wage. The market always clears. And then it's only some random shocks will cause something. There's no systemic pattern for panics or whatever it happens to be. That's the only way that just logically you can drive these erroneous expectations out of the system. So you are faced with a belief or with a choice. If you think people can, on average, have incorrect expectations, which is probably fits the real world, then that's one belief. Or you have the belief that no, that cannot be, because there's enough arbitrage, and that's why there's all these discussions of arbitrage things that possibly could do this. That's what led a lot of these people down this path. Now, they were thinking about a period of time, basically when they talked about this great moderation. Yeah, the economy seemed pretty moderate. Wasn't so crazy, in some sense, to think that maybe everybody was getting it more or less on right, and there'd be these little fluctuations. That's what motivated them. And that's the real business cycle theory. The only reason for fluctuation has nothing to do with, you cross off the finance, cross off the called the inequality part, where a lot of people are left out and borrow to this. They had this. So the only reason here is that there happened to be some fluctuations in the technology that Roberto put up. And those just happen randomly. Nobody knows when they happen. They happen. And the system itself just takes them, makes some modest adjustments, and gets back to equilibrium. So it's an equilibrium-based system. That's basically because people always expect more or less correctly, except for these small errors, which are not important. The fascinating thing is, how did this develop where you'd say, well, what kind of evidence was there for this hypothesis? Did they test it empirically? I said no. Did they test their model against other models using aggregate data? No. They got an interesting intellectual device. They calibrated the models, which meant you developed a simulation. You said the simulation has got to predict this perfect thing. It has to have rational expectations as part of it. And then you'd look around for parameters that would make the simulation work. So it fit. Over a period of stability, it wasn't so hard to find parameters, because the real world is looking very stable. And the model is saying we're going to be a very stable world. And it's based on these things. So I look around and get some parameters. And then this blew my mind when I saw this one guy saying, if you really believe this, you often have a story for any event. And Roberto referred to some of his things as conjectures. These guys don't have conjectures. They have true believers. So there is an article by an economist whom I know, for better or worse, who said the recent recession there's no real recession, there's no unemployment. US productivity has gone up. It's gone up quite a bit. Productivity's gone up because basically the firms have laid workers off as fast as they can, and there's no barriers to stop that. So in this model, a productivity shock raises people's well-being, because they know in the future the economy is going to be better off. They're viewing it as a real technological change. And therefore people seek more leisure. So it shows up in unemployment. Sounds utterly ridiculous, but there's some discussions of that. They will, at some point, and this is part of the real balance, the
Question.
Oh, question, yes, sir.
Isn't that impossible, given how much larger U3 and U6 are? I mean,
How much more?
marginally attached workers and underemployed workers? Include those you get up to 15.
Yeah, I don't know the paper did that. I'll give you the actual reference to the paper. It's an NBR working paper. Does this? Those guys are always, but see, the marginally attached, they're all taking leisure perhaps anyhow. It's a story that you could vaguely believe during a period of time when everything was stable and we were around full employment. It's a story I don't think, you're correct. You just can't believe it at this point. Well, I'm sure. So there'll be a recovery of this camp of thinking, and there already is, as Roberto said, the sound finance doctrine, and they're going to start blaming the government policies. They'll say, we would have recovered very quickly. The real reason is not that our model and our vision of this economy is wrong. It's that the government came in and messed things up. And you will hear that more and more, I'm sure. And you're beginning to hear that. So it's a vision. I was trying to appreciate where the thoughts are coming from. And then I want to give some, and then I pointed out, Roberto also put this, and I wanted to do it a little differently, the macro policy today versus the Great Depression. The big difference we have in the Great Depression so far has been in the monetary policy. And the dropping out of if Greece were to drop out of the euro, that would be the equivalent of when countries dropped the gold standard. And just like they stuck to the gold standard as long as possible, the Europeans will try to stick to the euro as long as possible until the German voters or somebody just says, nope, we're not going to do this anymore. They've also done, he called it basically inflationary, just printing money. But they did use, the Feds used its powers in novel ways to expand credit. And I've made a list of them here. And that I think Bernanke deserves credit for that, because it wasn't clear, that the normal tools of expanding the money was not enough, and he actually did a job there. And we said Roosevelt chose to balance the budget. Today, I think our fiscal, as I said at the beginning, our fiscal deficit, if you add in the states, is not very big, but because it's showing up in the federal government numbers, and we're discussing reducing it, which just has also the link to the Depression. This shows the fiscal stimulus packages as a percent, different countries. This is most countries. You don't have to worry about the states. See, the U.S., which this is basically from the ILO, their institute. You see, the U.S. is 5.6%, but our states are going the other direction, so it's going to go down to around 2% or so, et cetera. Saudi Arabia, I have no idea what they're doing. That's all. I just don't know Saudi Arabia. But China, I do know. China has been the only country, China and Korea have both recovered immensely. And if you'll read the papers just today, they're beginning to say, China, but they gave all that money and they ordered the banks to give those loans, but those loans probably aren't good loans, and somehow or other the sound finance will come back and bite China.
So Richard, just an interjection there.
Sure.
A question about your reference to the states in the United States.
Yes.
So this is an important point, right? That sound finance doctrine now in the United States applies as a matter of law in many of the American states.
Almost all of them.
So it has been translated into a mandatory legal framework, with the result that they, as a matter of law, implement a negative fiscal stimulus, which you must subtract then from the aggregate value of the federal fiscal stimulus.
That's right. And one of the parts of the ERA Act, the Obama stimulus, was to give some sizable amounts of money to the states. Not enough. And we will see if they can get a second some sort of jobs package out, but I doubt whether they will provide much, if any, extra money to the states, and that is a problem because you're having states that are working in the wrong direction. This is the official, only the Obama stimulus in the federal government. You see, it was about 2.5% of GDP, and then it goes down. There is a major issue about the going down, because if this deficit begins to go down, and I say the British, it's a political debate ongoing now whether the government will start pulling the plug on the deficit, and we do not have a recovery, then the work of getting to the recovery will be a real disaster. I mean, it'll be a long haul. And if we were like Japan, that would be a good solution, because I think in the U.S. and certainly the U.K., there will be massive unemployment. The inequalities are so much greater than in Japan that it will be much worse situation. Now I want to go to the Keynesian thought, because part of this is we're having some return to Keynes, and Roberto referred to the pretty lady, the beauty contest. And what I'd like to do, because I want this this will carry off to the next class as well, because it is important in understanding anything about finance. I want 3 volunteers to come and play a game in the front called Zigzag Zoog. It's a French Swiss, so I use the word Suisse here, children's game. Could I have 3 people just come up and just be 2 minutes to play the game? So there's got to be 3 people willing to come. Come. We got 1, 2, 3? Or you raised yeah, okay, we got 3 guys. This is going to, and this to me is what is wrong. You'll see in a second. Okay, this is the game. You just, actually, why don't you face the front? Everybody face the front will be good. Okay, you've got a choice. Either you put your foot forward when I say Zug, or you keep your foot back. You want one of your feet. So there's 3 of you. The person who is in the minority is the winner, and Roberto's going to give them a $1,000 prize. Well, he'll give them a lottery ticket that's worth a penny that could get you a $1,000 prize. That's the way we work those prizes. Okay, so I'm going to go Zig, and you're going to think now how you're going to make your strategy. I go, and you go, put your foot forward or not. Zig, zag, zoog. Winner! He gets the prize. Okay, you see what happened. No, it's a stay. We're going to play this for quite a bit of time. Okay, think what just happened. Zig, zag, zoog. Different guy won. Okay, you trembled your foot there. You almost did it. Okay, try again. Zig, zag, zoog. Okay, now this is the key. Now you were done. Fine, thanks. What's the lesson? They have to have some expectations about what the other people are doing. And I put it here as E of E of E of E of E of E of E. Now, it's Keynes's beauty contest. You're trying to guess what the average is guessing, but then the other guys are trying to guess what the average is doing. Keynes put it in average. We had 3 people, so they were trying to guess what the other 2 were doing. Or maybe you didn't do expectations. Were you doing it in that way, wondering what the other people were doing? You weren't. What were you doing?
Just putting my foot forward every time.
Just putting your foot forward randomly.
Every time.
Oh, you know you didn't do it every time.
You had no expectations.
Well, go see. There's a solution with no expectations. That's what I want to. Because you begin to say, well, do people actually sit there and go through this complicated expectations process? First thing is, there is no rational, stable equilibrium for this problem. Period. That model cannot logically work, because whether it's better to put your foot forward or it changes. Each one of the guys won once through a different. They put their foot in or they kept it out. I forgot now whether there was one where 2 came in. There was, and that's what one expects. Now that is the essence of a financial market, and that is the essence of the kind of the problem of the expectations. Why the rational thing ultimately does not make sense for this. There is no rational expectations in this thing, and Keynes had that that down there. Today that's called zigzag zoog. Not too many people know that that's what it is. And I've forgotten how I found that out. Probably was trawling the web late at night or something. And it's known as the El Ferro Bar problem. Does anybody know the El Ferro Bar? It's in Santa Fe. It's associated with the Santa Fe Institute, where and it was invented by an economist, Brian Arthur, at Stanford. And he wanted to go to the bar only when it wasn't too crowded, but he wanted there to be enough people there. And so then he started thinking, what happens if everybody has the same tastes as he does? Nobody wants to go to the bar if you're gonna, you'd be really crowded. And would nobody come? Would somebody come? And where do you end up? And now they do a whole lot of basically it's physicists they call it the minority game. Because the whole point is that the minority wins. The guy who's going against the majority, that's what financial markets are about. And now in the financial market, you're obviously trying to guess in some fashion what the majority wants next period. Yes, sir.
But question, Richard. So there's a dispute about this, because the question is whether it's just this or whether it's this and the combination of something else.
You're absolutely right. And no, I just wanted to get this point across, that this is fundamental. And then there's often something else you have to add in, even in the model context. And let me give an example. You'll have this operating, and you allow for leveraging up to a certain point, and then suddenly the leveraging has to come to an end because people panic. But the intellectual and practical interest presumably lies in the interaction between this judgment of opinion and what really will happen in the real economy. No, and the kind of institutions or rules that can reduce the probability that the judgment opinion leads to bank runs and collapses. And leveraging increases that probability. So yeah, but this is what's the correct word? It's one of these simple things that just to capture the notion. And it's very powerful against the rational expectations. Then we talked about the Ricardian equivalence. You mentioned that. And it's just said the same things here. To just point out that Ricardo did not believe in Ricardian equivalence. He goes on and he says, but of course people don't behave. I didn't give the exact quote. I don't have it here. But it's because people don't really behave this way. So it takes only modern economists to say this. And I said almost all empirical analysis rejects this. So there's a funny sense in which in your sound finance, there's point after point that we know
is false.
False.
Yeah.
And that it builds into this. The other part of the Keynesian thing, which I'm not sure what is right there, is you want the Keynesian thing will work well, and you won't get stuck with the deficit hawks coming in and saying no before you made the recovery, if this consumption multiplier, the multiplier is big enough. And so I put down a little multiplier, said marginal propensity to consume, and just said, well, if the marginal propensity is 8.8, you have a big multiplier, that means you get stuff done quickly. If you have a small one, then you have to keep your stimulus going for a very long period of time, and you can lose heart in this. And there's a lot of debate. I've not come to any views of that. Then I also wanted to give a little thing of the neo-Keynesian view.
But before we get on to the neo-Keynesian view, so what is your position? What is your assessment of the merits of this Keynesian view in the light of the experience of the crisis? In the light of the whole experience from the 1930s to today?
What I'm fearful of is this, that we don't have the, I don't know what you want to call it, the courage or the political economy to actually put in the stimulus that we would need to get the recovery, to basically substitute public activity for private activity. And that we're not going to come out very well. Does that mean the Keynesian thing is wrong? If you believe it's a very big stimulus, very big multiplier, I think that is not correct. You look at, they have a $50 billion to weatherize people's homes. The weatherize may not be 50 billion. It's 50 billion to the whole bunch of stuff, the caulking, but weatherizing is part of it. They have barely spent any of that money.
Yes, but there are two aspects. So you answered with respect to Keynesianism as a toolbox of policies.
That's right.
But then there's the question of Keynesianism as an intellectual guide to the formulation, to understanding and to policy. And what is your basic position as in the light of this experience?
I suppose that sense I endorse macroeconomic Keynesian kind of thinking. That yes, when some part of the economy disappears, I mean some spending part, and we have unemployed resources, the government has got, if you take this view, the government has got to step in some ways to use those resources. And that seems to me, it's a free lunch in the real sense, that if you can just do that with reasonable efficiency, why should we have resources go to waste because the financial sector gave us another crash? The toolbox is over the ways we do that, whether we are really capable of doing it, but as an abstract level, to allow resources to go to waste and people to be put into poverty when we think there's some things we can do is that, and that's the message I take from Keynes is you don't just sit there and do nothing, but then it is a toolbox kind of things as to which tools will work better, and I understand people on different sides. There are some, there's debate and discussion over that. The part that they never really put in is when the sound finance comes roaring back, which, and I certainly think the administration in the U.S. would have pushed a lot more money if they thought they could have gotten it through Congress quickly. That they were limited, and then you just wonder if the limits, build up, and then you are stuck in a Japan situation. China didn't have that, and China didn't have the banks sitting on the money, and that's why the fear, and maybe legitimate fear, that the Chinese banks spent the money so quickly, loaned it out. They have a lot of bad loans, and ultimately China. But better to deal with a banking crisis, if I can phrase it right, when you're at full employment, and than a crisis in the recession. Yeah.
Well, by some arguments, the output gap was $2 to $3 trillion, and some people argued that the stimulus should have been, at least like half of that size, if not more. But I'm just wondering, to your weatherization point generally, the government has really struggled to spend the money quickly, and so part of it is multiple levels of approval. Some projects have to be funded by states who have to hire new employees, so on and so forth to do for. So I actually don't quite understand how, if the stimulus had been even bigger, how we could have in fact gotten a bigger bang for the buck immediately,
Which you could have, yeah. The part that you could have gotten the bigger bang for the buck immediately would have been to basically have said, we're going to fund the states and localities, so no state employee. You could have stopped that negative part of the sound finance thing. You could have done that instantly. It wasn't a question there of finding new activities or work for the people, i.e. the policeman or the teacher. They would just keep doing the same thing they had been doing, and you could. I understand there's profligate states who like California, who were not meeting their things, versus states that were more, had taxed their people higher at the state level. But all that could have been dealt with. See, that you could have done, and then in a decline unlike this one, a lot of people would have said, well, you just do the tax cuts, because that's quick. It appears in people's pockets immediately.
And then they save part of it.
And they save part of it. That's right. That's right. In this one, I think they would save probably more because everybody's trying to get rid of those debts that they had accumulated. Yeah. So this is a more difficult, problem. It's. So I said here, yeah, the government moves slowly, and The Keynesian, just to get the neo-Keynesian view, and this is what's motivated that whole school of thinking. I think in the Akerlof reading you have, his Nobel thing gets it down very nicely. It's that, and again, now we don't have real evidence, but we have pretty good models that say this, that a modest amount of deviation from, call it perfect market behavior, is enough so that you can get real crashes and problems. So it isn't that if this part of the room, everybody's rational expectations, efficient market, and this part of the room is the same. And it's just you guys over here. And you don't need that many of you guys. So here it said that if everyone deviates a bit, or if it's also true if some people deviate a bit, for the system to work under this real business cycle, rational expectations view, it has to be like everybody. It's such a rigid model that is not a stable model, I would say. And so the neo-Keynesian perspective is they never believed this, but they didn't fight it very hard. Or when they did, people just said, oh, you're just saying it deviates a bit, but it's really different. Now I want to get to the sound finance issue, which I've been very, struck by. This shows graphs of debt and things going on. Our national debt is this, and then there's the sound finance man. They're saying game over. You imagine one day Tim Geithner going to Mr. Obama and saying, Mr. Obama, the bond market says no more stimulus. You gotta cut spending. That's what Bob Rubin would say to Clinton. The bond market says, and that's really what one is talking about. So we have the president announcing this bipartisan commission to cut the debt. And you just sort of sit there and you say, yeah, well, it's N years down the road, and what do you think of, et cetera. And then he does the stuff of some on the left believe the issue can't be deferred. Well, of course, the Obama plan is going to be to defer it into the future without saying it. They're certainly not, the Brits is where they're talking about very quickly cutting this deficit down, et cetera. It turns out, I checked the opinion polls. The best I could find is something in Bloomberg, and they said the average American is a little more sensible about this than maybe some others. They want the money spent to create jobs, and they want to send the bill to the rich. So you just see this, and that said, yeah, they'll have to make some sacrifices in the future, which would be the Ricardian equivalence kinds of stuff that everybody recognizes. Ultimately, things have got to be paid for in some sense. But most people say, tax the rich. That's the current view. That doesn't look too likely. These are the projections that is bothering the administration on the fiscal deficit, where it will reach, where it may get beyond. So you see the deficit going zooming down. Then the other thing is the debt going zooming up. Turns out Japan has a debt relative to GDP of over 200%. And Japan is paying very low interest rates. So it's not clear that any of these things are actually things that necessarily have to stop it, but there's a question of belief. Here's again, federal debt, and you do see the World War II, we were way above, but of course we had a controlled economy then. We had price and wage controls of different sorts. We had a very different economy. And this is the debt of different countries. You see Japan is 218%. And there's the government bonds. That's the interest rates. They're very modest. Because the claim would be, as you get your debt up, they're more and more afraid you're not going to pay it. And they demand, this was the Greek situation, and they're going to be demanding higher and higher interest rates until the interest rates reach an abnormal level. Let's be clear. There's two kinds of interest rates. I borrowed money from Roberto, and I owe him money, but we're both in the same country. Higher interest rate? Fine. The country taxes citizens and pays them. It's just a transfer among Americans. Or it could be a transfer among Greeks or Brits. Then there's the money you owe the other countries. And of course, the US has a big debt to the Chinese. The Argentinians did abscond, they did have a sovereign debt crisis, and they paid back about 25 cents on what they owed. That is a possible solution for people. that would not win us, this country, much friends in the world, and would have a problem. And then you look down here and you see, as of fourth quarter of 2009, the Greece was no different than lower interest rate than Ireland. Italy wasn't extraordinary. There's a Moody's estimates, and you have to say the following thing. And this is where recovery gets interesting. Right now, you'd rather have your money, even in Greek bonds, than in some private corporate monies, because they're great risk that everyone feels. Countries are more likely to pay than companies. As we recover, companies will suddenly be, you'll feel better, more comfortable putting money in the company. And that means as we recover, the interest charges to the countries will go up. And it's just a very interesting balancing game. And I know the Fed has thought, has been thinking about this, and they're worrying about when and how and trying to do as rational as they can. It doesn't mean they'll do it right. But it's kind of because you do want the government, basically, deficit to fall as private spending goes up. The government deficit is meant to cover for the missing private funding, but it's got to be done in a careful way. These are the current government bond yields, and they are really low. The U.S. is low. The U.K. as of fourth quarter 2009 was even lower than the U.S. So right now it's a good time essentially for governments to borrow money and to run up the deficit and add to the debt and put the money into the whatever they can, however they can do it under this Keynesian policies. And so they'll have a lot of deficit, a lot of debt at low interest rates. Pretty good idea. It's an ideal time for them to do this. And then I just went through a little calculation saying what is sustainable. And I just put it all depends, and that's not a very good answer. But we normally think of, if we knew a good debt ratio, debt to GDP, we can always keep running a deficit. Because GDP grows at a certain fraction, and the deficit grows at the same amount, or the ratio of deficit to GDP is they grow at the same amount. It's stable. So we shouldn't even be talking at some level about getting a deficit down to zero. If we get a growing economy, we can run bigger deficits. And the key thing is what the debt to GDP ratio is, and then it's how much they're charging for our interest rate in interest, and how much taxpayers are willing to pay for this. But I've been struck, we are not out of this crisis, and we're already starting all the sound finance stuff, and that's dangerous. These were some calculations I did, which didn't bring in the states. I tried to do them myself, but then I found a paper that did it, but I found it after I made these slides. It came out of the NBR just Friday night or something, or things. So you have taxes over GDP dropping. We've had some tax cuts, but a lot of that is that people's incomes have fallen, and so we're getting less taxes out. And of course, the civilian expenditures rose. That's part of that is the Obama program. The military rose 1 percentage point, which is not quite as big as the civilian, but it's fairly sizable. And we're now at a 10% deficit ratio that people are worrying about, but it's at a low interest rate, so we shouldn't be worrying that much. I would have said, even from a fiscal things. Then our friends the Greeks, this is Zorba, and you see those rates suddenly began zooming up, and today Adair Turner, who's one of the wiser heads in the United Kingdom, just said, let's start investigating the hedge funds as to how much they're betting against their Greek currency, because that has become a giant thing. There are credit default swaps involved here. Those prices have also been going up. That's insuring your bonds. And there are a lot of people who are looking from the finance sector to make a lot of money by breaking either the Greeks or whatever country they can do.
But they don't really have their own currency, being in the Eurozone. They don't have control.
No, that is correct, but then you're betting on, will the Germans really bail them out? Will they pull out? Et cetera, et cetera.
Because
so, that's correct.
Strictly speaking, it's an obvious point, but it deserves to be mentioned. It's not as if other solutions did not exist. It's that they're regarded as not politically palatable. So, for example, the debt can always be monetized.
Correct. For the Argentines did their business and they survived, and the world lent them money again after these guys I owe money for. I'm not going to pay you guys your money. Sorry. So I go over to you guys and I say, look, I've got no debt. Will you lend me something? And there's a question whether you will or you won't. The Argentines proved you can do that. Yeah, I think for the Greek thing, the problem is, the minute Greeks pulls out of the, and they are going to have their interest rate will go way up. The benefit of staying in the euro is the interest rate is lower, and they have some global guarantee. It's not because they'll be in your international anarchist area. But there are, I don't. So here's the Greeks protesting the austerity moves, and then I just would conclude with the thing we have to keep remembering. It's the real costs of this disaster. This is the U.S. job loss. So the new number came out today. We only lost, or at least the current estimate from somebody, 20,000 jobs this month. Well, that little red line shows the job loss compared to every other previous economic recession. And you see we are headed for a very, very long period even now. The unemployment spells in the US, which has always been short unemployment spells, have been going up. That's the very far end. You see it going up. And that's only the end of 2008. So we add this to the Department of Labor that gets their act together and does 2009. We'll see that's gone up. Our university. I think about the end of the Alston Science Complex, because I was told by one of the scientists that he was going to invent a pill that was going to make all of us more attractive to the opposite sex. That is being withheld from us because this is not going on. That's a real advance. That because meaning R&D projects, investment projects, real things that will make people's lives better are stopped because of this. I went and checked the housing market. 25% of all mortgages in the U.S. are underwater. We are going to keep seeing the housing market drag things down. I'm checking for housing, the one in Scottsdale, which is Arizona, it's a giant mansion. It's down to 1.5. I will check next week. When it gets down to, I don't know, $100,000, I'll go and buy it. That's the Pigou, a little bit of the Pigou effect. That big deflation, you can do things. But this is all over the country. We haven't dealt with this. So I think the fact that the real disaster is ongoing here. And I concluded with a lady you know well. And it really isn't over yet. And a lot of things Roberto said I agree with, except for his optimistic conclusion that by somehow or other we're going to...
Not optimism, Richard, hope.
Hope, okay, hope is good. Hope I
optimism is a contemplative, ironic attitude. Hope is an existential orientation. So now, I should say I'm advised that the first half of the class was recorded.
Oh, good.
Because there are microphones in the ceilings in this room. Even the walls have ears.
So we don't need this kind of nonsense.
Yes, and no, but we need it to improve the quality.
I see.
That in the next class before the spring recess, we will assign the second brief paper.